beyond our wonderful guest, we are having a blessing of the co-moderator, newly elected of the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church in the USA. Tony Larson was elected at the General Assembly that just met a few weeks ago. He is a pastor, along with his co-moderator, also in South Carolina. And I know he's not only interested in this program this evening for our denomination, but also possibly for his own church as well. So I'd ask you all to, well, the tradition is to rise for the moderator. I don't know what we do on Zoom, but we can wave at him, I guess. And he has graciously agreed to give a blessing for the beginning of this program. Take it away, Tony, please.
Thank you, Bruce. Thank you for the invitation. You have the, I guess, the distinction of being the first post-assembly invitation that I've been able to accept for being with a group of Presbyterians and others interested in the work of the assembly and the ongoing work of trying to make our churches and our communities more environmentally responsible. So I do bring greetings on behalf of the 226th General Assembly, the commissioners, the advisory delegates, the corresponding members, and all those that gathered in Salt Lake City to do the work of the church for this time. And as Bruce said, I was privileged, as those who were in Salt Lake were, to hear from Mr. Newman at the General Assembly, and so I'm excited that we have a bit more time to hear and to engage with him today in ways that the Inflation Reduction Act can be a tool for helping our congregations and communities make investments in green energy. So as we gather tonight, though, let us do that in prayer. So if you join me in prayer. God of all creation, we know that this very day, the planet is warmer, that species are under threat, that communities are imperiled. And we ask your forgiveness for the ways that we have not been the stewards of creation that you would have us to be. We give thanks this evening for the tools of government that can help move us forward in progress. And we give thanks for communities of faith that are seeking ways to be more responsible stewards, to transform their properties into places that generate renewable energy for their congregations and for mission and for communities, and give public witness to the need to care for your creation. Open our hearts and minds, open our ears to hear this presentation tonight, that we might make progress in greening the church. It is, after all, Christ's church, and in whose name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, co-moderator. We're very grateful that you could be with us this evening, and thank you for the prayer. So I wear a variety of hats. Besides being the moderator of Presbyterians for Earth Care, I'm a pastor, and I've been that for a number of years. 18 years ago, when I was serving in Delaware, the church at Limestone Presbyterian Church in Wilmington, after an in-depth study, put 180 solar panels on our sanctuary roof. And I want to tell you that was not only good for the church's pocketbook and saving on electrical expenses, and it was not only good for caring for God's creation, which was my primary motivation for doing it, but something I had not foreseen until it happened was it was a beautiful form of evangelism. We found that there were young people, young families, concerned about the future, concerned about God's creation, and were excited to see a church doing things that made a difference in a very positive way. So when you're thinking about this, think about making sure that is part of your thought process. And if you've already done it, be bold in sharing that you've done it, not only for the sake of attracting young families, but for other churches and individuals to copy your example. We are very thankful that the government, for the first time, has provided funding not only for individuals, but now for nonprofits, including churches, to have funds made available to do some wonderful work that will accomplish all of these things. And we could not get a better speaker than the one we have this evening. And I want to give thanks to Sarah from the National Interfaith Power and Light, who gave us a heads up that he was interested in talking to Presbyterians. We were able to arrange an interview with him when he was in Louisville, where our national headquarters are, when he was speaking to the Episcopal bishops. Right after he talked to the Episcopalians, he sat down with a wonderful reporter from Presbyterian News Service, Mike Ferguson, who did an excellent feature story about what he's doing. That in turn helped us persuade the General Assembly to give him a little bit of time, but we're going to give him a lot more this evening. So, Ronnie, take it away, please.
Thank you very, very much, Bruce. Good evening to all of you across the country. I very much appreciate you giving me some time tonight to talk about the Inflation Reduction Act and the ways in which it can open up opportunities for churches and other nonprofits. Again, my name is Ronald Newman, and I am a senior advisor at the U.S. Department of the Treasury, working on Inflation Reduction Act implementation. With the time we have together tonight, I will run through a wealth of information about that piece of legislation, and in particular, the provisions and tax credits that are uniquely applicable to churches and other nonprofits. And then on the back end, we will reserve a fairly substantial amount of time for Q&A. And so I hope to have a good, hearty back and forth with all of you to talk about the clean energy transition and the clean energy journey that we're taking as a country. For tonight's presentation, I will share a PowerPoint deck that I think will help to emphasize some of the key points, facts, and themes that I hope to share. So bear with me just a second as I share a screen that will hopefully aid in our conversation. Okay. I think we ought to be in business at this point, but if you are not seeing a PowerPoint slide deck, please scream, because I am assuming that we're looking at the same thing at this point. So as signaled in this top card, what we want to talk about tonight are nonprofits, tax-exempt organizations, and the ways in which nonprofits in particular can leverage the benefits woven into the Inflation Reduction Act. Let's get started. So at the top, I'd like to start the conversation with essentially a baseline disclaimer. My colleagues at the Internal Revenue Service remind me repeatedly to be clear that I am not here with you tonight providing tax advice. I am not your tax professional. I'm not your tax preparer. What I hope to do is provide some general information that you will find useful as you think about Inflation Reduction Act opportunities. But one, if there is ever any doubt, please refer first and foremost to the detailed and authoritative tax guidance that is issued by the Internal Revenue Service. And it can often also be helpful to engage a tax professional who can work with you through your specific set of facts. So with that disclaimer done, let's jump into some of the content. So as Bruce hinted earlier, the Inflation Reduction Act is the largest investment in clean energy that we've ever made as a country. The early estimates indicated that the overall amount of funds destined to be moved by this legislation was nearly $400 billion. Since then, estimates have landed on even higher totals. And part of that is because the way the Inflation Reduction Act is structured, most of the money moves through tax incentives. So the overall volume turns on decisions made by me and you and state and local governments and businesses and individuals all over the country. The more people that take advantage of these tax credits, the more the investment associated with the Inflation Reduction Act ends up being. And so that bill has a broad range of tax incentives and tax credits that are applicable to several different beneficiary groups. As I noted, large businesses, small businesses, nonprofits, state and local governments, individuals, housing developers, et cetera, et cetera. And we'll talk about, in particular, the tax credits and provisions that, again, are uniquely applicable to nonprofits. That's our task for the evening. In this next slide, what you see are a handful of provisions that are most commonly discussed when engaging nonprofit communities. The first is direct pay, which is a cross-cutting provision that unlocks the individual tax credits for nonprofits. We'll talk a bit more about what that means on a subsequent slide. But then you also see a reference to the investment tax credit, the commercial clean vehicles tax credit, the charging refueling stations tax credit, and then a reference to what are called bonus credits. Again, further detail will be laid out as we move through the slides, but this is the universe that is most commonly targeted by nonprofits, by churches, and the like. What I've done here before we dive into more detail on the specific legislation is I've tried to identify some of the benefits and advantages of leveraging the Inflation Reduction Act. Because whenever you're having a conversation like this, that at some points will get super detailed and super nuanced, the important question at the top is, why is this important? Why do I need to be on this Zoom call? Why do I need to engage in these discussions with my church? And what I've tried to identify here are some of the core reasons that we recognize as a government, but also core reasons that I've heard from churches and other nonprofits all around the country. So it's not only reducing the purchase price for clean energy investment, it's also reducing month-to-month utility bills. It's also serving as a symbolic force within your community. It might also be serving as a place of refuge. I'm sure many of you are aware that power outages strike and frankly seem to be striking jurisdictions more and more frequently. Friends and family members in Houston recently went through a period of a week and a half of power outages. For solar and battery storage installations, one option that churches have is to essentially become a place of refuge during situations like that, where people can come and get access to electricity, can refrigerate their medicine that needs to be kept refrigerated. All of those types of collateral benefits may come along with taking an action, leveraging pieces of the Inflation Reduction Act. So the first item on that initial slide was what we call direct pay, elective pay. This is a truly unique and novel piece of the Inflation Reduction Act. Historically, as the government rolled out tax credits in various subject matter spaces, those tax credits were largely irrelevant to tax-exempt organizations like churches, because if you are not in the habit of paying federal income taxes, the benefit of an offset in the form of a tax credit won't get you very far. And so direct pay was woven into the Inflation Reduction Act to get around that problem, to get around that challenge. And so because of direct pay, churches and other nonprofits can receive tax-free cash payments in lieu of that tax offset. So the exact same amount that you would otherwise receive as a tax credit, you can simply receive as a direct payment from the IRS. That is in many ways, a revolutionary provision that has made new opportunities possible for nonprofits all across the country. The other thing I tend to mention in these discussions is recognizing the nature of these tax credits. I'm sure many of your congregations have applied for grants from time to time, and grants can be great sources of resources that allow you to do things like capital expenditures. But most grant programs are limited in amount and they're competitive in nature. And so you may win, you may lose. One unique feature of these tax credits is that they are, generally speaking, uncapped. So if you meet the criteria, you can access the funds. And that gives you an added level of assurance when you're thinking about making a particular upgrade. Here you have additional information about direct pay. And the one thing I'll lift up is, in thinking about the criteria connected to direct pay, one important criteria to mention is the requirement that you register in advance of submitting your tax filing, in advance of requesting that tax-free cash payment. It is a sort of system that has been set up by the IRS to allow us to start thinking about your claims in advance of tax season, and to also do certain anti-fraud related measures that are important to ensure that these programs are run effectively and efficiently, and in a way that does not make them susceptible to fraudsters and other bad actors. So that was direct pay. And again, what direct pay does is it allows nonprofits and other tax-exempt entities to leverage tax credits that prior to the IRA, they would not have been able to leverage. You should know that there are 12 tax credits that are eligible for direct pay. So there are a number of tax credits in the Inflation Reduction Act. 12 of them are accessible through direct pay. So again, directly accessible by nonprofits like churches. And again, I am talking about 3 of them in particular, as well as bonus credits that might be connected to them, because in practice, these tax credits are the most frequently leveraged by nonprofits. The first of those you see information on before you. That is the investment tax credit. The investment tax credit generally amounts to 6% of the cost of an investment, but that 6% increases to 30% for projects that are smaller than 1 megawatt or that meet certain labor requirements. For the purposes of churches and nonprofits, generally speaking, your installations will be lower than 1 megawatt. It is the exceptional nonprofit installation that rises to the level of greater than 1 megawatt. So the baseline becomes that 30% mark. And so if you make a $100,000 investment, you are essentially putting yourself on a trajectory in which you can receive a $30,000 check from the Internal Revenue Service to help offset a portion of those costs. In addition to that 30%, there may be opportunities to access bonus credits. You see those listed below. There is a low-income communities bonus credit, an energy communities bonus credit, a domestic content bonus credit, which can take that 30% and make it 40% or 50%, or in the right set of circumstances, as high as 70%. Second, I'll mention the commercial clean vehicles credit. We commonly refer to it as 45W. Again, the credit amount here is up to 30% with a separate limit connected to the type of vehicle in question. And so if you transition from an internal combustion vehicle to an electric vehicle, for a passenger vehicle, you can receive up to $7,500 to offset the cost of the vehicle. For a larger vehicle, for instance, if your church, if your congregation maintains a bus, you can receive up to $40,000 to offset the cost of that vehicle. So depending on your circumstances as a church, as a congregation, that's another credit that you might consider leveraging that can be accessed through the direct pay mechanism. And then finally, there is the EV charging station or refueling station tax credit. We commonly refer to it as 30C. Again, this is a credit that can take you to the 30% level if certain labor requirements are met. A couple of important flags in relation to 30C. 30C only works within certain qualifying census tracts. So the location for your installation either has to be a low-income community or a rural community. And I have included a hyperlink in the presentation that can be shared after this Zoom call that presents a mapping tool that can allow you to quickly determine whether the location of your church is within one of these qualifying districts. The only other thing I'll mention briefly here is that I've seen really unique and compelling examples of churches leveraging 30C in expansive ways, not only to allow for the charging of church vehicles or frankly, the charging of vehicles owned by church staff, but the leveraging of EV chargers for broader public accessibility reasons, or even to generate revenue. So to the extent your church is located in an area where there is a heavy amount of street traffic, presenting EV chargers in a generally accessible way can allow folks passing through the neighborhood to access those EV chargers, and again, can potentially become another revenue stream for a sort of house of worship. And again, with that additional revenue, you can invest more in mission-oriented activities that are important to the church. The next slide presents one of many, many examples that have popped up around the country during this period post-August of 2022. What you see in the picture is an overhead shot of the Watts Willowbrook Church in Compton, California. They recently installed a 12 kilowatt system, and you see basic details associated with the electricity cost savings they are likely to be able to accrue over the next 20 years and the reduction in CO2 emissions. You know, those two parallel pieces are perhaps the greatest selling point for making one of these clean energy installations. You can save concrete dollars that can be channeled into other mission-oriented activities, and you can also save the planet and care for this earth that we share. The only other thing I'd flag here is for entities that are helping with the financing of solar installations, there are lots of options out there, whether there are loan constructs or lease constructs or power purchase agreement constructs, but many of them entail little to no required down payment. And so you can potentially put your congregation in a situation where they can move from a monthly utility bill to make up a number, $500, to a monthly utility bill of $200 or $100, or maybe it's eliminated altogether. There may or may not be a loan payment on top of that, but in many instances, the combination of the lowered utility bill and the loan payment is still markedly below what your historic utility bill might have been. And that goes to the point about actual concrete dollar savings. A few additional points as we sort of move to the sort of closing of the presentation. A lot of these issues will not feel immediately straightforward to the leaders within your churches, but there is a ever-growing collection of third-party organizations that are stepping up to support and provide technical assistance to churches that are thinking about some of these decisions. And so whether that's assessing the church to figure out which energy efficiency or clean energy measures are the most bang for the buck, or helping walk you through the process of doing a clean energy installation in an efficient and effective way, or providing the financing that may cover the gap after you've received your direct pay check from the Internal Revenue Service, or the final step in the process of getting your actual tax submission made to the Internal Revenue Service, which can in turn generate that tax-free cash payment that we talked about above. And so Bruce mentioned Interfaith Power and Light earlier. That is obviously an incredibly helpful and important third-party organization that is helping churches all across the country. But there are a collection of others. And so that's another place where we can potentially be helpful, pointing you towards resources that are out there that you can leverage as you think about making these moves. A few more points. I want to use the sort of extra time that we have by this longer sort of webinar session to make sure you can get a picture for the sort of tangibility of the process, what it means to actually go through this journey. What you see on the slide before you is essentially a step-by-step walkthrough of the journey you would take. For instance, if you were looking to install solar on your church, you figure out the project you want to do. You figure out a contractor that you can work with. You get that project done and you place it in service. Once it's placed in service, that triggers your tax year. That's how you determine whether that's a 2023 project or a 2024 project or a 2025 project. It's not when you start the project. It's not when you enter into a contract with the contractor. It is the moment in which the installation or project has been placed in service, effectively when you're able to use it, when you can flip the switch and power starts to flow. That's the important operative date. As mentioned earlier, once your system's placed in service, you'll have an opportunity to register with the IRS. It's an essential step that you need to do in advance of actually filing your tax return. You eventually get to the point of filing your tax return, and then you get to the best day of the process when you receive your payment from the Internal Revenue Service. But that step-by-step hopefully provides a feel for the journey that you need to take advantage of these opportunities. Here, you essentially have that same step-by-step process, but connected to a timeline that, again, hopefully makes it feel more concrete and tangible. So if you did a project anytime in 2023, you would turn around and in late 2023, you may have pre-registered with the IRS. By May 15th, which is the general date for, or general deadline for tax-exempt entities to file, you'd need to submit your tax submission, or you could request an extension, which would move that date to November 15th. But in any event, 45 days after you've submitted your tax return is when the IRS is generally telling folks they should expect to receive their payment. Sometimes it comes before, but that 45-day window is the window that we generally discuss with folks. I mentioned pre-filing registration. What you have here are a couple of screenshots of the portal in which that is done. The IRS has set up a sort of clean energy online portal that allows us to work and operationalize these processes. And so I wanted to provide a flavor of what that interface looks like. And there are user guides, there are video tutorials, there are a range of resources that you can leverage that can effectively help walk you through that process. One sort of final note about what you might refer to as the capital stack. I know in many cases, churches may be looking for other funds to support their clean energy project. And another great feature of the Inflation Reduction Act is that you can leverage and take advantage of grants without effectively cannibalizing the direct pay tax credit money that you might receive. And so again, on a $100,000 project, you're perfectly entitled to seek and secure a $70,000 grant to pair with your $30,000 direct pay cash payment to effectively zero out the charge, the cost to your congregation. And so that's an important feature to keep in mind, because sometimes with tax credits of this nature, you end up needing to apply the tax credit amount to the post-grant cost. That's not the case here. The only exception that you might want to keep in mind is that the IRS has issued guidance that prohibits what we tend to call excess benefit. And so, for instance, again, on that $100,000 investment, you couldn't create a scenario in which you received a grant of $80,000 specifically to do your solar installation and then separately recoup $30,000 from the IRS for that same solar installation, because that would push you to $110,000. So in a scenario like that, the credit would effectively be reduced to $20,000. Again, that's a prohibition on excess benefit, but that's not a prohibition on essentially getting to zero. Before I close, I would be remiss to not note that churches have this extraordinarily important potential role to play in reminding their congregants and members of those churches that, separate and apart from any tax credits and provisions that relate to nonprofits, there is a broad spectrum of tax credits and other benefits that apply to individuals, to families, to consumers. And ideally, we're in this fight and taking this journey together. And so the degree to which you can promote the tax credits and other incentives to your congregations, the more progress we can make overall. And so what I've done here is I've highlighted fairly quickly the 5 core consumer-oriented tax credits. And then on the next slide, you should also be aware that there are rebates that are being administered by the Department of Energy and individual states that can also serve as another government-provided benefit that can reduce the cost of making some of these decisions. These state-based rebate programs are slowly but surely becoming live. So the New York program is launched, but other states are still going through the process, and we expect to have a handful of new state announcements soon. So it's important to flag that the tax credits for individuals are completely live and operational. The rebates are still a work in progress, but we're getting close to having those live and operational in a broader spectrum of states. What you have in closing, and what I can do is share with Bruce and Mindy afterwards a copy of this PowerPoint presentation, which includes these hyperlinks. So everything that I've just relayed is captured, along with lots of additional detail in some of the hyperlinks that are provided on this slide. This slide connects to a handful of resources that the Treasury Department and the IRS have put out connected to elective pay, direct pay, and nonprofit uptake. And then I've also included some key resources that folks may want to keep at the ready for individual consumers. And so hopefully, even beyond this conversation that we're having tonight, you can leverage these additional resources to ensure that any questions that you or your fellow congregants or the leaders of your church have can be answered effectively. So with that, I will wrap up my initial presentation, and hopefully there are 17,000 questions in the audience that we can pour through between now and 8:30. But hopefully that has been helpful. and hopefully that has been clear. Again, thank you for giving me some time.
Bruce, you need to unmute, please.
Thank you. We ask that people do down below in the Zoom, if you can click the icon for raise hand, that puts you at the top of the screen. So Bob is ready for his. I will just do a testimonial for the IRA. 2 weeks ago, my wife and I bought our first electric vehicle, and the dealer took off $7,500 because of the Inflation Reduction Act. So I wholeheartedly recommend it. I also want to highlight, we did a webinar last week with a church in Maryland that made use of IRA funding to do their solar project. And they're doing something unique. It's not only benefiting their church, but some of their neighbors as well. And that video recording is available now online for you to check out. So, Bob, you were good to be first to raise your hand properly in the Zoom. What's your question?
Our church has been putting in solar panels. It's almost complete. I started to do the registration process and I wanted a copy of our 990T. We don't file a 990. I looked into PCUSA. They don't file a 990. So how are we supposed to put that in the application?
Okay. So a couple of things. First, I want to do a quick second on Bruce's comment. So congratulations on the EV. I mentioned earlier in the presentation that direct pay was a completely novel sort of innovation in the Inflation Reduction Act. The issue that Bruce mentioned is another example of the innovation that we're trying to drive within government. Obviously, tax credits as a general rule are accessed when you file your taxes 4 to 8 to 12 months after you make the relevant purchase. In the context of EV specifically, we have pioneered a sort of tool that is called the transfer election, which can allow you to transfer your EV tax credit to a dealer at the point of purchase, which is awesome because instead of waiting until you file taxes to access that $7,500, you get it immediately, and it essentially immediately reduces your purchase price. So things like that we've tried to pioneer. They're working pretty well, and we hope to be able to do more of these types of things in the future. So to the second question about the non-90T, I may need you to restate a portion of it. The pre-registration process occurs at a time prior to tax filing. It needs to occur at least 4 months prior to tax filing. And so that registration process essentially gets you, your project, what you've done into the system, so the IRS can run various checks in the lead up to tax filing season. When tax filing season comes, you end up needing to file your base document, which may be a non-90T. Generally speaking, form 3800, and then one more form that connects to whatever your specific project has been. So the IRS form 3468 is the form that's connected to the investment tax credit. And so that collection of documents is what you end up submitting during tax filing season. And then you receive your payment from the IRS. I recognize, because I've heard in lots of my engagement, that for churches that aren't filing taxes on a regular basis, making your way through that process can be extraordinarily daunting. And we understand that. And one of the reasons I included the slide in the presentation about some of the third-party organizations that are cropping up is because there are more and more entities that are looking to be there for you as you go through that process for the first time. I was on a webinar this past Wednesday with a group called Lawyers for Good Government that have just launched a new tool that allows nonprofits of various stripes to essentially reach out and request assistance as they're trying to make their way through that tax submission process. And so we understand that it's sort of a new and complicated piece, but we and external partners are working diligently to make it as easy as possible.
Thank you. Mindy, you want to raise some of the questions that were put in the chat before people had a chance?
We have some questions from earlier on in the presentation. Okay. Jim Turner, I've heard from a solar company rep in a distant state. It makes me wonder, are Wall Street equity firms getting onto installing solar? I'm sorry, getting into installing solar. I'm wary of not dealing with a local brick mortar based company. Any perspective on that from the Treasury end?
Well, I'll just say quickly, there has been a massive flood of new investment in solar across the full spectrum, whether that, from residential solar to utility scale solar. We as a country are moving to the use of more and more renewable energy sources, and that is a good thing. And there are various actors of all types that are looking to invest in the space because of that trend line. To the second part of the question, the only advice that I would give or the Treasury would give is the same advice you'd give to anybody making a sizable investment, to shop around a little bit. Reach out to a handful of installers and see if they're presenting similar types of information, see who's the most responsive. I think this is another place where you can leverage the benefits of some of these third-party organizations, because some of them have worked with other churches in the past to do solar installations, and so they can share with you what X church or Y church's experience was like with a particular installer. But that process of crossing the T's and dotting the I's and checking with different installer options is a big part of making these types of investments effectively. The last thing I'll mention is we have engaged recently with our colleagues at CFPB and the FTC, other federal agencies, to try to develop more consumer, but also advisories more broadly related to the solar space. And I think we'll have more materials to issue soon that essentially just help you think about what questions to ask. When you meet with that solar installer for the first time, you might want to ask them these 7 questions and see what you think of their answer as you're trying to make a decision who you want to be a partner with on this journey.
I would strongly recommend people checking out the Interfaith Power and Light website specifically for churches exploring solar. They have a wealth of very helpful information. And they also often have state chapters with people in the neighborhood who could also be of help to you. Do you have another one in the chat?
The next question in the chat, actually, Karen also has her hand raised. I'll read what's in the chat, and then maybe if she needs to elaborate, she can. From Karen Worley. So if my church's solar panels aren't placed in service until January of 2025, does that mean we cannot file for the credit until 2026?
Generally speaking, I think it depends a little bit on when your tax year is. But if you assume your tax year is the calendar year, then that placed in service date of January 2025 would make 2025 your tax year, at least for purposes of that clean energy installation. And so then the following May of 2026 would be when you'd submit your tax filing. And so if you think back to the timeline that I shared during the presentation, the first stop was, finish the project, place it in service anytime during 2023. In your hypo, that would be anytime during 2025. Then you'd pre-register at some point later in 2025, ideally before the end of the year. And then in 2026, you'd be able to submit your tax submission and receive your form. And so that's essentially to make these direct pay claims workable for the IRS. We're essentially doing tax processes on an annual basis. And so, unfortunately, that would be true.
I do want to,
So,
just excuse me for 1 second. Presbyterian Investment Loan Program has a special loan called Restoring Creation at an even lower interest rate. Very good interest rate that is designed to help churches that could be done in sync with the funding from IRA. So you might be able to get those funds from our denomination quicker than you could from the IRA. And in turn, that is at a very low interest rate. I believe the president of Presbyterian Investment Loan Program was registered for this evening to be with us, Claire Lewis. I don't see her on the screen. Also, Catherine Lynch, who's one of their regional reps. But if you go to the PCUSA website, that information is there as well. Karen, did you want to say more?
well, my church is already doing, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
My church is already doing that. We've applied for a Presbyterian loan. We're dealing with Catherine Lynch. It's a great, I mean, it's already in progress, but we're thinking that our panels are not going to be placed in service until January. And we're worried because the Republican Party platform wants to repeal the Inflation Reduction Act. And therefore, we're gonna have spent this money depending on being able to get $100,000 tax credit, and we're concerned that then it will go away after we've already spent the money. And I was wanting to, and I'm terrified now the fact that you said I have to wait another year. Do you have something to say about that?
So thank you, Karen. I appreciate the question. I will say at the top, I am not in the political prognostication business, so I'm not in a position to tell you how November will go. I will say that the Inflation Reduction Act passed in August 2022, and in the period since August 2022, a significant amount of action has occurred by the business sector, by the investment sector, by individual beneficiaries of the Inflation Reduction Act. And more of it is happening every day. There are more and more winners, more and more beneficiaries, more and more constituents that are committed to the long-term sustainability and durability of this framework. Does that make it a guarantee that nothing is changed about that framework in the situation in which a different set of political actors control DC? Of course not. But I do think it creates a reason to believe that enough of a foundation has been built that you can feel confident moving forward that the rules that exist today will be largely, or if not wholly, the same rules that apply a year from now.
Really?
So Karen, hopefully that's helpful.
Well,
Thank you, Karen. I
and
can't.
if we could apply in January, then maybe the budget wouldn't have been, or the Inflation Reduction Act wouldn't have been repealed yet. But if we have to wait another year, that's where the risk comes in.
Yes. What I will say is there are, again, a significant number of actors, frankly, in many cases, more in red states than blue states, that have made a series of multi-million, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollar investments reliant upon the framework, the infrastructure that has been created by the Inflation Reduction Act. And I would think that a lot of those folks would have a lot to say if there were ever an attempt to genuinely repeal the benefits and tax credits and incentives that have been provided by the Inflation Reduction Act. It's simply not a situation in which we can guarantee what the political actions of a future government are. But this is not the first instance in which a piece of legislation has been passed by one set of government actors and is needed to endure as the political winds in DC have changed. And so if past is prologue, I wouldn't be deeply worried that the Inflation Reduction Act is going to disappear anytime soon.
I will plug, we will be having a webinar in the fall about the elections and environmental concerns. Going on to Laura, what's your question or comment?
Thank you. This has been really helpful. My question is, if a church completes more than one project, say you put solar panels on and you convert your heating and cooling to geothermal in the same tax year, can you apply for reimbursement for both of those projects? Is there any limit to what you can apply for in a particular tax year?
Thank you, Laura. That's a great question. So no, the
Great.
point I made earlier about these tax credits generally being uncapped, that also applies to, for instance, a number of projects. If you think about some of the business-focused interests that are leveraging tax credits, they may have projects all over the country. And so they are submitting 5, 10, 20, 50 projects that are eligible for these tax credits. One of the innovations that the IRS has woven into that portal that I mentioned earlier and shared is the ability to do bulk uploads, right? So I'll give you one example, right? So if your church purchases a solar installation, you are the owner, and so you are the person that can claim the tax credit. If your church, on the other hand, leases solar panels, you are not the owner, and the company, the business entity that leases those solar panels to you is the owner, and they can claim the tax credit. And so you have lots of institutions like that will, or for instance, in 2023, installed solar panel installations all over the country. And so for each of those would be sort of individual projects that would be, if they're a nonprofit entity, would be registered through the direct pay portal and constitute different separate, projects. So no limit, go for it.
Great, thank you.
Joanna?
Thank you, Mr. Newman. Thank you so much. You've been so gracious being with the Presbyterians since the General Assembly. I have 3 questions, and I hope they can tag into each other. And at the same time, if there's anything that I am not in order for you to answer today, that would be fine. The first thing is, Mr. Newman, today, I heard you in your presentation, a slight distinction between what you call the qualifying standards and the qualifying projects. And if that is spelled out anywhere else outside of your presentation, I would really appreciate knowing that. And I wanted to also ask you, what is your take about the qualifying standards and the qualifying projects? Because this is not simply about the viability or the sustainability of our congregations, right? We all care about this earth. We all want to do something faithful, which tags to the next question. Often when the congregations, and especially because Mr. Newman, you are working with faith-based organizations, we do not make decisions, and the Presbyterians, whether it's good or not, we do everything. We strive to do this in order. We have some processes that play into to the life of the congregations of the entities, the faith-based organizations. So how does that first question that I was asking you, which I heard to make the distinction, how much do we have to take into consideration when we are applying for this grant And how should we be faithful and also savvy and wise in making decisions on whether we pursue a project that may not be under the qualifying standard, I guess. So, and the last piece is, the last question that I had to you, you've been so gracious to being present in the General Assembly with the committee, really just adjusting and adapting to all the needs that the plenary needed. But you're not available to all of us anytime and every time that we may run into a block or question to be answered that may transcend the needs of our paperwork and the filing of the process. So what is your best advice that those of us who showed up today to take some energy and also effort and also to partake in this program to benefit our faith-based, our churches, but also the community at large as just people. What is the best way for us to access that kind of hands-on help?
Thank you.
You wanna, I guess, when you're not available to all of us at every Zoom call. So those are my 3 questions. Thank you.
So I'll say quickly on your final question and your first question, we've tried to produce more and more resources that you can access that allow you to read in detail what the various eligibility standards are and various sort of qualification rubrics are. And I'd like to think that the information that we've put out can help answer any and all of those questions. But part of the reason we continue to do stakeholder engagement is because it gives us an opportunity to hear the questions that people are posing. And so if they're asking questions that aren't readily answered in some of those documents that I hyperlinked in my deck, we go back to the drawing board and we try to help produce additional materials that can help folks. So beyond this conversation, there's a wealth of resources that go into far more detail that I would point you toward. 2, I do understand that the church processes for thinking about these types of projects can be complex, but in some ways, I think they can be unique experiences for faith communities, whether you set up a church committee or a working group to help think through what makes sense for the church. That can itself be a great learning process that can get the full congregation excited and enthused about these projects that are aiming at, preserving the earth that we share. You made a point about how much I've engaged with the Presbyterians, and I've tried to engage with lots of nonprofits because I do think that not only are there new and different opportunities for nonprofits that haven't existed historically, I want to make sure you're on notice of, but I also firmly believe that you have a sort of symbolic leadership role to play within communities that transcends decisions that other entities might make. There was recent research that indicated that when anchor institutions like a church install solar over the course of the next 5 years, there may be 80 houses, 80 residences that follow that action because maybe they're members of the church and they see it and that causes them to think about it in a different way. Maybe they're just driving past it, but it is such a sort of force within the community that it projects out in a way that influences the actions of others. So that's part of why we're engaging. The last thing I'll say, and we can try to make sure this information gets circulated. I cannot stress enough the importance of organizations like Interfaith Power and Light and some of the other TA providers, because they can be with you and walk through this journey sort of hand in hand in a way that the Treasury Department in Washington would never be able to. So I'm here to hopefully pique that interest, get you excited, trigger a conversation with your congregation next week. And then there's a broader ecosystem that can help you get from the starting point to the finish line.
We had a question in the chat if this is going to be made available. Yes, the recording will be made available. You're going to make available your PowerPoint, so people will have that as well, and links to all the different sites. And again, look at things in the chat. Some people are answering questions that folks are raising with details such as interfaith power and light being a very good one to go to. It's good to see Mr. Sanchez, I believe, from North Carolina. Please unmute.
Thank you, Bruce. Mr. Newman, thank you for the great presentation. Several questions, but before, just to let everybody know, since 2019, we have installed a solar system in our church, 47 kilowatts, that today provide 90% of our electricity. So now we want to go to the next stage and to see if we can get 100% or more. And so the question is, does the IRA provide the facility to replace the old HVAC systems with newer, more efficient, or do they have to be strictly heat pumps? And given that my awareness of the IRA provisions are that they can also, you can also, as a taxpayer, you can also replace the old hot water systems with hybrids or on demand. And the third question also related, in our effort at the church, if we can expand the solar system and include a battery system, which today we don't have, would that also be included as a project under the IRA?
So I'll say a couple of quick things, and I think this is another question where I think it would be tremendously valuable to leverage some of the resources that I included in the deck, because I think all of those questions are answered in some of those resources. But I'll say quickly, projects like battery storage connected to your solar, or for instance, a geothermal heat pump system that might provide heating and cooling, those types of projects could be covered by the investment tax credit that I highlighted during the presentation. There are other types of energy efficiency measures that don't fit as neatly under that rubric. So I'll give one example. Air source heat pumps that you might install in your home, that is covered by 25C, which is a tax credit that is accessible by individuals, but not naturally covered by the investment tax credit that applies for, business entities. So, part of why I'm sort of encouraging you to reference some of those documents is that these sort of lines and distinctions and differences are spelled out in each of them. But broadly speaking, the framework allows for action on a broad and diverse spectrum of either clean energy projects or energy efficiency projects.
Good. Thanks.
Elizabeth?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the presentation. My question is again on the heat pumps. So air source heat pumps for a church would not be available for direct pay, but can you negotiate with the installer to get the tax credit? And also for ground source heat pumps, I understand that would be available for direct pay, but to get the full credit for it, the installer or supplier would need to meet the PWA, the prevailing wage, and other requirements. Is that right?
Yes, so a couple of things. On the second question, the sort of 1 megawatt exception could potentially apply in your situation and allow you to automatically go to 30%. And I can also make sure I sort of share some additional information about how that can play out with different types of projects, be they solar or be they geothermal heat pumps. So there is a scale demarcation that determines whether you automatically start at 30% or whether you need to ensure that in your contract, for instance, with your contractor, you stipulated that PWA requirements need to be met. So it can vary depending on the scale of the project, but hopefully that answers your second question. On your first question about the heat pump, you may have to remind me on that piece because I don't know if I completely followed the question.
The air source heat pumps, can the installer get the tax credit and then you would negotiate a lower price?
Yeah, I can think about that more. It's not immediately coming to mind a scenario that would facilitate that type of action. So I'm not saying no, but I am also not saying yes. I do think there have been a range of different innovative and creative solutions that have been developing in the tax credit space to help people work around some of the restrictions and limitations. I'll just, give you an example. In the residential context, it has been one challenge for low and moderate income people is that a tax credit won't get you very far if you don't actually have the tax liability to take advantage of that tax credit. And so that is a challenge that we've sort of dealt with within the space. I bring that up because one of the creative solutions that has bubbled up is that certain nonprofits have launched programs in which the nonprofit has purchased the panel and they can access direct pay. So they can essentially just receive a direct cash payment and then they can lease those solar panels out to the homeowner at a reduced price because they're cheaper panels. And then the homeowner can get access to lower cost energy benefiting from an IRA tax credit, even though they were in a position where they couldn't directly leverage the tax credit. Again, that's not a solution for the specific question you asked, but it is a sort of point that generally there's a lot of creativity and innovation flowing into this space that hopefully will unlock even more opportunities than the sort of obvious sort of baseline ones that we've talked about.
We have gone over the hour. If you're willing to stick around, we'd be very grateful to make sure more questions are answered. I do want to share a couple of slides on behalf of Presbyterians for Earth Care. Mindy, could you toss those up, please? Okay, so not that one. That's what we already have. That's the next one coming up on September 25th. Edible Landscapes and Climate Resilient Communities. We have two wonderful folks from Virginia and Arkansas talking about how people are planting trees and bushes that are producing things that people can eat in their communities. This is good for the community. It's good for individuals. It will be a wonderful webinar. And again, it will be free on September 25th. The next slide is all of these things are free, but there are expenses involved in it. And if you found it a helpful program tonight, please donate so we can do other programs. Is that the last slide?